Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
When you grow up in a house where love is measured in smiles reserved for someone else, you learn pretty quickly where you stand. And I stood in the shadows, quiet, cautious, always hoping, rarely seen. My older brother Tom was born 22 months before me, but he might as well have arrived centuries earlier because the space he took up in our family felt ancient, absolute, and immovable. Tom was the sun, and I was expected to orbit him politely, quietly, without ever asking why I didn't get any light of my own. He won trophies. He got the biggest slice of cake. When he failed, it was the coach's fault, the teacher's vendetta, or Mercury in retrograde. When I failed, it was because I didn't try hard enough, didn't smile enough, didn't behave well enough. Mom had 100 excuses ready for Tom before he even needed them, but for me, she had a single phrase that she used like a hammer: don't make everything about you. I remember this one birthday, my 9th, I think, when she baked this beautiful, rich chocolate cake. It looked like something out of a bakery window, decorated with glossy ganache and tiny sugar flowers. I stood by the kitchen counter, watching her slice it, knowing full well I was allergic to cocoa. And when I hesitated, she frowned, handed me a plate, and said, "Just eat around the chocolate." Like it was my fault for not being grateful enough to choke down an allergen on my birthday. Tom had 2 pieces. I had hives. She didn't notice until after the guests left. Years went on and nothing really changed. Tom got a car for his 16th birthday. I got a stern lecture about responsibility and a part-time job at the library. He wrecked that car 6 months later. Dad was furious, but Mom smoothed it over, said boys are wild, and besides, he was under a lot of pressure from school. When I got into a fender bender in my 20s, she called me reckless and asked if I'd been texting. I didn't even own a smartphone. I didn't hate Tom, not exactly. I envied him. I resented him. But I didn't hate him. He wasn't cruel, just casually indifferent, like someone who grew up being adored and never had to consider that other people weren't getting the same kind of treatment. He gave me the occasional nod, a pat on the back if I did something impressive, but never really saw me as his equal. Not then. Not now. When I went through my divorce, I remember picking up the phone to call my mom, hoping, stupidly, I admit, that this time she'd be on my side. That she'd offer support, maybe even say she was proud of me for walking away from a man who didn't love me anymore. Instead, she sighed deeply and said, "Well, you made your bed, Rachel. Now you've got to lie in it." And then she changed the subject to Tom's new vacation home in Arizona. She never offered money, even when I told her Lily needed therapy and insurance wouldn't cover it. She said things were tight. That she and Dad had been saving for some renovations. A new sunroom or something. But just 3 months later, I found out, through Facebook, no less, that she and Dad had helped Tom put a down payment on a second house. A big one. In cash. With a pool. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stared at that photo, Tom grinning in front of the sold sign, Mom in a floppy sun hat beside him, looking like she'd just won a damn lottery, and I felt something shift inside me. Something cold. Something permanent. That was the moment I realized I was never going to get the kind of love I had spent my life chasing. Not from her. Not from him. Not from anyone who still treated me like a placeholder instead of a person. I started writing things down after that. Not for therapy, though God knows I needed it. I just wanted a record. A map of all the little cuts that finally drew blood. The birthdays forgotten. The accomplishments dismissed. The family dinners where I was asked to bring dessert, but not included in the photo. I kept every email. Every text. Every voicemail where she used that icy tone that sounded like a compliment if you weren't paying attention. And it wasn't just the big betrayals. It was the casual ones. The way she'd show up for Tom's kids' school plays and forget Lily's dance recital. The way she'd ask Tom how work was going, then change the subject before I could answer the same question. The way she once said, "Well, Tom has a lot on his plate, Rachel, when I asked why she didn't hold him to the same standards. The worst part? She believed she was being fair, that she had given me the same chances and I had just squandered them. That my failures were mine alone, but Tom's were circumstantial. I stopped arguing. You can't reason with someone who's rewritten the story in their head so many times they actually believe it. The day I found out about the money, the down payment for Tom, I didn't even confront her. I just smiled, saved the post, and filed it away. I knew then that my revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be angry. It wouldn't even be obvious at first. It would be quiet, precise. And by the time she realized what I'd done, it would already be too late. Because the truth is, she didn't cut me out of the will that day at her birthday party. She just finally said it out loud. Some lies wear mascara and pearls and smile sweetly over a glass of Chardonnay while telling you that your memory is faulty, your tone is hostile, and your hurt is just you being dramatic again. That was my mother's specialty. Polished denial served with a chilled glass of Sauvignon Blanc and a twist of condescension. The older I got, the more I realized that her version of love came with conditions, edits, and a heavily curated narrative where I was always just slightly out of frame. After that Facebook post about Tom's second house, something in me cracked open, not loud, not showy, but quiet and final like a hairline fracture you only feel when the weather changes. I didn't lash out. I didn't even confront her. I just began to observe. Closely. Critically. Like a scientist studying a long-term experiment that everyone else thought had been abandoned. I dug into the past, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. I needed to know if the fog in my memory had been real or if I'd just been trained to doubt it. I started with the family photo albums. You know the kind. The heavy leather-bound books with little plastic sleeves that stick to your fingers when you try to slide a photo out. Mom kept them in a hall closet, carefully stacked in chronological order, like the holy scriptures of our family legacy. And at first glance, everything looked picture-perfect. Smiling kids, birthday candles, beach trips, matching sweaters at Christmas. But when I looked again, really looked, a different story emerged. Tom was in every photo. Centered. Lit well. Smiling like he had just been handed the world and was trying to decide which part to keep. Me? I was either out of frame, half cut off, blurred in the background, or looking away. In one photo, I swear I remember being there. I wasn't in it at all. Just Mom, Dad, and Tom at some county fair. She must have taken the photo herself or asked someone to crop me out. When I asked her about it later, casually over lunch, she looked at me like I was accusing her of murder. "You're remembering wrong, Rachel," she said, without missing a bite of her salad. "You were never really into family outings, remember? Always had your nose in a book." I wanted to scream, but instead I nodded, because that's what you learn to do when your reality is treated like a rude interruption to someone else's story. It got worse when she started planning her 60th birthday party. You'd think it was a royal wedding the way she talked about it, the wine, the guest list, the speeches, the cake. And not once did she ask me what I thought about anything important. Just flowers. Just the seating chart. "You're good with the small stuff, honey," she said, patting my arm like I was a volunteer at a church bake sale. "Tom's going to give the speech. You know he has a way with words." I laughed, but not because it was funny. I laughed because I finally saw it clearly. She didn't just love Tom more. She needed him more. He made her feel successful. I reminded her of her flaws. She gave me a list of people to invite, most of whom I hadn't spoken to in years. People who still called me Tom's little sister like I didn't have a name of my own. As I went through the RSVPs, I started counting. Just out of curiosity. There were around 90 people at that party, give or take. I counted 86 just in our side of the family alone, and maybe 15 of Mom's book club friends. And yeah, I know what you're thinking, that math doesn't add up. But I wasn't exactly focused on numbers. I was focused on something else entirely. 2 days before the party, I was at her house dropping off a sample floral arrangement, pale pink roses and hydrangeas, exactly what she'd asked for, and while she was upstairs on the phone with her best friend Linda, I noticed a folder on the kitchen counter. Not hidden, just sitting there like it belonged in plain sight. Inside was the most recent version of her will. I know I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. And the moment I read the first paragraph, I felt a cold wind move through me even though the windows were shut. Everything went to Tom. The house, the lake cabin, the vintage jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, even the piano I'd learned to play on. My name wasn't listed once, not even a passing mention. Not even a Rachel may take the china if she likes. It was like I didn't exist. And the kicker? It was dated 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. Meaning this wasn't some oversight. This was a decision. A fresh, conscious, deliberate erasure of me. I put it back exactly how I found it and walked out of that house feeling lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter because the pretending was over. Heavier because now there was no denying it. She didn't forget me. She erased me. On purpose. And yet, she still expected me to show up at her party and smile for the camera, to help with the place settings and nod politely during Tom's speech and clap when she toasted herself. But I wasn't the same woman who had let herself be cropped out of photos and gaslit into silence. Not anymore. The guest list might have been hers, but the ending? That was going to be mine. The morning of my mother's 60th birthday arrived dressed in sunshine and denial, 2 things she wore effortlessly, like pearls and perfume, masking the stench of all the history she chose to forget. Her backyard had been transformed into a spectacle of self-celebration. Pristine white tents stretched over rented chairs, pastel centerpieces bloomed across tables, and a string quartet tuned their instruments like they were about to play at a senator's wedding. Everyone was smiling too widely, standing too straight, complimenting the wine like they hadn't been dragged there by obligation and guilt. And me? I was floating through the day like a ghost with excellent posture and a dry sense of humor, ice calm on the outside, but seething quietly under my skin. I wore a navy dress, not because I liked it, but because it made me feel invisible, which is how I had survived most family events without starting a fire. My daughter Lily was there, her face composed but wary. She knew enough to sense the storm underneath my calm, and she stayed close, like she was afraid someone might throw a drink or a truth. I told her to just enjoy the cake and keep an eye on Grandma's wine glass. She smirked and said, "What, like yell duck if she gets mean?" I didn't laugh, but I did feel the edge of a smile. That girl, she's got steel in her spine and sarcasm in her blood, a perfect cocktail of survival traits she inherited from me without even trying. The crowd grew as the afternoon wore on. Distant cousins, book club ladies with large sunglasses and small opinions, a few neighbors, and of course Tom, who arrived late and loud, shaking hands like he was running for office. He wore a custom suit, smiled like a politician, and had the kind of confidence that only comes from being told your whole life that you're the best thing that ever happened to your parents. He hugged Mom like she was royalty, and she beamed like she'd just given birth to him 5 minutes ago. I watched it all from behind a table, sipping sparkling water and counting lies. I knew the moment would come, the speech, the toast, the performance she'd been rehearsing in her head for weeks. She took the microphone just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the lawn and turning the whole scene into something that felt oddly cinematic, like we were standing on the edge of a revelation. She began with charm, thanking guests, recalling childhood stories about Tom's first tooth and her favorite recipe, offering the kind of anecdotes that made her seem warm and relatable if you didn't know how much venom she could drip into a single sentence. People laughed, nodded, sipped their drinks. And then, as if tossing a bouquet at a wedding, she turned her eyes to me and said it. "And to Rachel," she said, lifting her glass with a smile so smooth it should have been illegal, "you're out of the will. But you always said you wanted independence. Now you have it." There was a silence that spread through the yard like spilled oil. For a second, the clinking of glasses stopped. One of the violinists made a nervous motion like they might start playing again just to break the tension. Someone laughed, a high, uncertain chuckle, and then a few others followed, unsure if this was a joke or a joke-shaped insult that everyone was supposed to pretend was funny. My stomach flipped once hard, but my face didn't move. I stood slowly and picked up my own glass, water, not wine, and raised it as high as hers. "That's fine," I said, voice level and loud enough to cut across the chatter, "because you're no longer in mine." Gasps, whispers, the sound of someone inhaling sharply like they'd been punched. I turned my head slowly, made eye contact with Tom, who looked as confused as a child who's just been told the toy store is closed forever. My mother's smile twitched, just once, before she caught it and forced it back into place like a mask slipping on sweaty skin. I didn't wait for a response. I reached into my purse, pulled out a plain white envelope, unsealed, because I wanted her to know I wasn't hiding anything, and walked it to her. Her hand trembled just a little as she took it, probably thinking it was a letter or a final plea for attention. I leaned in and said, quietly but clearly enough for the front row to hear, "Read it when you're alone." Then I turned and walked away. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady and certain. Every step felt like peeling off a second skin I'd been trapped in for 4 decades. People stared, but no one stopped me. Lily followed without a word, just matched my stride like we'd practiced it. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. Later, I heard from one of the book club ladies, a woman with a fondness for gossip and mid-tier Riesling, that Mom opened the envelope alone in her bedroom that night, expecting a sad little letter. What she found instead were printed emails. Real ones. From her own friends. Messages full of snide remarks and secrets. One in particular stood out, apparently. A thread between Linda and Carol, laughing about Barbara's old affair with that married man from church, and speculating that Tom had accidentally moved a few too many zeros from Dad's retirement account. I didn't need to be there to see her face when she read it. Some bombs don't explode. They unravel. And some toasts? They're better when they go down bitter. Revenge, when it's slow enough, doesn't feel like revenge at all. It feels like control, like reclaiming the time you lost, like pulling the strings in a play that everyone else thinks they're starring in. For most of my adult life, people thought I was passive, the kind of woman who took slights on the chin and kept smiling, who let things roll off her back like raindrops on wax. But passivity is often mistaken for patience, and that was their first mistake, assuming I hadn't noticed, hadn't remembered, hadn't been filing everything away like receipts for a rainy day I knew would eventually come. I wasn't silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was preparing. It started small, years before the birthday party, years before the will, years before I stopped asking my mother to love me the way I needed and started documenting the ways she didn't. I began saving texts, the ones where she canceled on Lily's recitals at the last minute, the ones where she'd accidentally forget my birthday or make excuses for why Tom needed her more. I screenshotted threads, emails, little snippets of conversations that made me feel less crazy when the gaslighting kicked in. If memory was the battleground, I was going to arm myself with evidence. I even recorded calls, not everyone, just the ones where I felt like I'd need to remind myself later that I hadn't imagined the coldness, the digs wrapped in silk, the way she'd say, "You're always so sensitive," after making a remark that would leave anyone else reeling. In some states, that's illegal, but in mine, it's admissible. I checked. Twice. Tom was harder to pin down, not because he was smarter, trust me, he wasn't, but because he was slippery, charismatic, the kind of man who could walk into a room and convince people he was doing them a favor just by breathing their air. But charm has a shelf life, and Tom had started to rot underneath his glossy exterior. His marriage was fraying at the edges, his job at the law firm was teetering, and he was hiding something. I could smell it before I could prove it, like a dog who knows there's something buried under the porch. The proof came in a voicemail. One of those accidental pocket dials people forget they made. It landed in my inbox one random Thursday night, static at first, then muffled voices, then his wife, Grace, sharp and loud, saying if they find out you've been moving money from those accounts, they're not just going to fire you, Tom, they're going to prosecute you. He didn't deny it. He just told her to lower her voice. That was all I needed. I didn't go straight to the firm. That would have been reckless. Instead, I waited. I waited until the birthday party had passed, until the wine had dried on the tablecloths, and my mother had finished licking her wounds from the envelope I handed her. And then I sent an anonymous tip to the firm's human resources department, attaching the voicemail, along with a few little breadcrumbs I had picked up from Grace over the years, dates, transfers, account names. Just enough to raise a few eyebrows and trigger an internal audit. They started asking questions within a week. Tom called me 3 times in one day. I didn't answer the first 2. On the third, I picked up, waited for him to yell, and then played the voicemail back to him. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. He hung up before it finished. It wasn't just about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. It was about clarity. It was about showing my mother that her golden boy had clay feet, and that her desperate attempts to build a dynasty on favoritism and lies had left her with nothing but a mess she couldn't clean up. She called me, of course, left messages that started polite and spiraled into panic. Rachel, let's be civil. This affects the family. You're hurting your brother. But I had already stopped considering her family the moment she said I wasn't in her will. Now she was just another woman trying to manage fallout without admitting fault. So I made one final move. I signed over the rights to whatever portion of inheritance she would have given me, assuming she had ever intended to be fair, which she hadn't, to my daughter Lily. I did it publicly with witnesses, and I mailed the signed documents to my mother with a handwritten note that said, "She'll be the only legacy worth anything in this family." Lily didn't ask for it. That's what made her worthy of it. She never begged for approval, never groaned under the weight of trying to earn a place in a broken hierarchy. She just watched, learned, and grew stronger because of, not in spite of, the dysfunction she was born into. I figured if anything good could come from all this venom and dust, it should go to her. I heard through my aunt, the only relative I still trusted, that my mother cried when she read the note. Not loud, not theatrical, just quietly, like someone who realized too late that the things they planted grew thorns instead of flowers. I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't feel anything at all. Some people wait for justice. I planted it and watched it bloom. It didn't happen all at once, the unraveling. It came in slow waves, a headline on a legal newsletter about an internal audit at Tom's firm, a hushed conversation between 2 neighbors outside the grocery store, a delayed family group chat that suddenly burst to life with vague concern and poorly concealed satisfaction. It was like everyone had been waiting for the golden boy's halo to slip, and now that it had, they were finally allowed to say what they'd kept quiet for decades. Nobody wanted to be the first to call him a fraud, but once the door cracked, the flood came rushing in. Tom was under investigation, his firm had frozen his accounts, and from what I heard through my Aunt Sharon, who always knew more than she admitted, Grace had moved in with her sister and taken the kids. She left behind the house, the cars, the credit card debt, and about 16 years of unspoken resentment. Barbara, meanwhile, had taken to calling me every morning at 8:15, like clockwork, and then again in the evening. Not once did she say she was sorry. Not once did she use the word regret. Instead, she left these long, rambling voicemails that sounded more like political statements than pleas for reconciliation. She kept using words like misunderstood, complicated, and history, as if explaining why you chose one child over another could somehow undo the decades that came before. As if the weight of omission could be lifted with enough eloquent rationalizing. She didn't cry. She didn't even beg. What she wanted was the narrative back under control, and I was the last thread she needed to tug to pretend this wasn't all her fault. I didn't call her back. I didn't even listen to most of the messages. After the first few, I let the voicemail fill up until the notification stopped blinking. If she wanted to talk, she could talk to the silence she'd handed me for most of my life. Let her live in the space she'd left me in since I was old enough to understand that love, in our family, was not a right but a reward, and I'd never earned enough to cash in. One afternoon, about a week after the second voicemail stopped, I got in my car and drove to the old neighborhood. I wasn't sure why. There wasn't anything there for me, not really. But the house still stood, pristine and cold like a dollhouse no one wanted to play in anymore. It looked smaller than I remembered, as if the illusions had peeled away with age and left only structure. I parked across the street and sat there, not crying, not aching, just breathing. It was just a house. 4 walls, 2 windows, and a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. There was no magic left in it. Whatever ghosts had once lived there had already moved on, probably following my mother around like tired shadows, waiting for her to look in the mirror. I rolled down the window, let the wind blow in, and wrote a letter on the back of a grocery receipt. Not to her. She didn't deserve my words anymore. It was to me. To the girl who used to sit at the top of the stairs, listening to Tom get praised for winning another spelling bee while she clutched her perfect math test with no one to show. To the woman who once thought that maybe if she just tried a little harder, smiled a little wider, made fewer waves, she'd be let in. I told her goodbye. I told her she didn't need to ask anymore. That the only permission she ever needed was her own. I left the letter in the glove box and drove away without looking back. Weeks passed. Then a month. Then another. And then, without warning, the final twist came in the form of a manila envelope dropped on my porch by a courier who didn't even wait for a signature. Inside was a copy of Barbara's latest will, the one she had signed after the party, after the toast, after I'd walked away. As expected, everything was left to Tom. Every antique, every account, every heirloom she could legally pass down. It was written in that cold, clipped legal language that manages to feel deeply personal despite its formality. My name was nowhere to be found. But that wasn't the twist. The twist came in a second envelope, stamped from the county clerk's office, confirming a property deed transfer filed 5 years ago. It was signed by Joe, my father, just 6 months before he passed, and it stated clearly that the house, the very same one Barbara still lived in and claimed as her own, had never actually belonged to her. It was solely in his name, and he had transferred it to me. Not to Tom. Not to Barbara. To me. No ceremony. No conversation. Just a signature, filed and notarized in a quiet office while Barbara was probably across town getting her nails done or sipping tea with her book club. I don't know why he did it. Maybe he saw the imbalance and tried to correct it the only way he knew how, in silence. Maybe he knew she'd never treat me like I mattered, so he left me something that did. I could have evicted her, of course. Legally, I had every right. I could have forced her out, taken the furniture, changed the locks, sent her a notice, and watched the chaos unfold. But I didn't. I left her there. I let her live in the house she thought she owned, surrounded by things she never truly saw, haunted by the daughter she never really knew, with the knowledge that even after all her planning, all her manipulation, all her careful rewriting of family history in the end, she got nothing she hadn't earned. She still calls sometimes. I still don't answer. Mom always said I'd never be anything without her. Turns out I became everything because of her. Just in spite of her.